Hey guys, Alex with Infotainment here. Today we're going to be working on our Wrangler Sport, and we're actually going to be putting the 1.5-inch lifted Rubicon suspension on it. This is pretty much a direct swap out, and we're going to get started and show you how. So the first step of any suspension lift is going to be to securely lift the vehicle. Today we're working on a 2-post lift. We realize that not everybody has access to that. This can be done on jack stands. Just make sure the jack stands are rated for your vehicle. So the first step is to go ahead and remove the tire. So I'm going to walk you guys through what we're changing out here. So most of the components are actually the same from the Sport to the Rubicon, but the main difference is the spring. So the Rubicon spring is about 1.5 inches taller than the Sport spring. So basically we're going to be removing the spring and the shock as well. In addition to the spring and the shock, a lot of guys will replace all of these control arms, but they are the same length as the Sport, so you're kind of wasting your time if you're going to swap all the arms out. But if you wanted a complete Rubicon suspension, you can swap them out, but again, they're the same length, so no change there. So after we take the wheel off and lift the vehicle, we're going to use one of our safety stands. You can also use a floor jack to support the bottom knuckle. We're going to go ahead and remove our 18mm bolt that holds the sway bar end link in. Just going to rotate this up out of the way, and we're going to repeat this step on the other side so this doesn't hold the knuckle up as we're trying to drop it. So on the passenger side, we're going to go ahead and take this 18mm bolt out right here, and that holds the sway bar end link. That'll allow us to remove the sway bar up and rotate this backwards. So now the sway bar is free and out of the way to drop the suspension. So after we remove the shock absorber bolt here, we're going to go ahead and take our brake line brackets off. Basically, when we extend this down, we don't want any of our brake lines to stretch. So there's one 15mm nut here, there's a 10mm nut here, and a 10mm nut right here. There's also a little plastic push clip right here that goes to this breather hose. We want to make sure this little breather hose is disconnected as well, so when we drop the diff, this doesn't get stretched. Go ahead and set that aside. This comes off there. So this breather hose is now free. The brake lines are free as well. And we have one more 10mm screw right there. On the front side of the knuckle, there's one 13mm screw. Now we're going to go ahead and remove this here. That will release this clip off the top of the knuckle here. So now all this is free. We can make sure we don't pinch anything. So now this whole brake line circuit is free, so for when we drop this, it doesn't stretch any of our cables. So after we've got the shock loose here, we're going to drop the axle and pull the spring out. So I have this set up with a floor jack holding the knuckle up, and I'm going to go ahead and bring the knuckle down and take the spring out. Once we've got this loose, I'll wiggle the spring out here. So now the spring is out, and we will replace it with our Rubicon front 1.5 lift spring. So now we'll take our 1.5-inch lift spring, we're going to feed it up through the bump stop. Might have to drop the axle a little bit further down to get it clear. It can only go on one way here, so go ahead and position it properly, make sure it's seated up above. So once we get this back in, there's this little lip right here, and this part of the spring will actually sit in this plastic retainer. And we're going to go ahead and lift the knuckle back up now. And as we're lifting back up, we just want to make sure the spring gets seated inside that clip I pointed to earlier. So after we've lifted the knuckle back up, we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of our shock bolt here, which is just this 18mm up top here. And that's got its own nut on the back, so I'll actually just go ahead and pull this out. This will drop right out. In one shot, we will take our new one. And basically, what the red one does is it extends the whole suspension travel by 1.5 to accommodate that additional lift. And to complete this side, we'll go ahead and lift the floor jack up to mate these two eye holes right here. So we'll take our bolt that we took out earlier, slide this through, and we'll tighten up on this on the other side, button everything back up on this side, and we'll move to the passenger side. So we're going to leave these undone until we complete the other side, just because the diff still needs to drop a little bit on this side, but now this side is pretty much complete as far as the lift goes, so we'll go ahead and move to the other side and complete the same thing we did on this side. So moving over to the passenger side, we're going to go ahead and take this 10 mil off. This is a 15 mil off right here. This 10 mil as well, and then a 13 millimeter on the other side of this knuckle here, and that's going to drop all of our brake lines. After we're done with that, we'll support the axle with a floor jack, take the 18 millimeter shock bolt out, drop the spring again, and lift it all back up. After that shock bolt's out, we should be able to drop the axle now. And again, what we're trying to do is remove this spring here. Go ahead and set the old spring aside, and we will take the new Rubicon spring. Might need to press down on the axle just a little bit to get a little bit more space. We'll go up with it. Drop the axle as far as it'll go. Set the new spring in place. We can start jacking the axle back up. At this time, we're going to go ahead and remove the remainder of the shock with this 18 millimeter bolt up top here. Again, you can push the splash shield aside and get it with a ratchet. This splash shield here is a little bit further away than the old one, so we're going to go ahead and use a ratchet wrench. Without removing the splash guard, this is where we're trying to get into. So this is your shock bolt pocket right here. So now we have the 1.5 inch lift spring on the passenger side with a 1.5 lifted strut on the passenger side as well. And as you can see, this is the red Rubicon strut. We're going to go ahead and button up all back our brake lines and move on to the rear of the vehicle. Before we move to the other side, we're going to go ahead and drop the sway bar end link back down here. It'll sit right in there. And this is what we call a flag nut, which are awesome because they're self-tightening. Make sure this shock bolt is nice and tight. Get that rattling around. We are done with the passenger side. We're going to move over to the driver's side, put our brake line and our sway bar end link back on, and then move to the rear of the vehicle. So back on the driver's side, we're going to go ahead and put our brake line brackets back on, our sway bar end link back on. So we'll continue putting our brake line brackets back in. 15 down here. One thing we don't want to forget to do is to reattach our breather tube. Take this hose, put it back on the nipple on the drive shaft differential. Take our needle nose pliers and take the hose clamp and bring us back home there. So now we have all of our brake line brackets. I took this little plastic clip off here too. Let's slide that back in so we have all our brake line brackets nice and secure here. Straighten up the wheel. We're just gonna go ahead and put our lower stabilizer bar end link bolt in, and we are done with the front. So after we've done that, we have all of our bolts nice and tight. We are done with the front. We're gonna go ahead and move along to the back. So moving on to the back of the Jeep, we have a very similar process. There's two springs that lift the back of the Jeep 1.5 inches, and we'll go ahead and get started by taking both wheels and tires off here. So to start on the rear, we're going to go ahead and support the axle with a floor jack. We're going to be removing the sway bar end link here. These two brake line brackets, there's a 10 millimeter here, and then right on top of the knuckle, there's a 13. And then to achieve the lift, we're going to be replacing this spring and this shock with a longer one. And again, that will give us our 1.5 inch Rubicon lift. So after we've supported our axle with our floor jack, we're going to go ahead and remove our sway bar end link. And this is an 18 and a hex 6. We'll also have to remove it from the bottom, which takes an 18 millimeter. After we've removed our sway bar end link, we're going to go ahead and just take our brake line brackets off. This is a 10 right here. Put that bolt aside. We have a 13 in here. Set that bolt aside. This gets removed, so now the brake line is free, so when we drop our axle, we're not pulling on these here. So after we've removed our brake line brackets, we're going to go ahead and remove this small splash shield right here, and this is held on by two 8 millimeter screws, and what we're trying to do is access this 18 millimeter upper shock bolt. There's also a third 8 millimeter screw at the top here, right above the one I just removed. So now we have access to our 18 millimeter shock bolt up here, and this is held on by a welded nut on the back, so just an 18 mil here. We'll just go ahead and get that loose for now, and now we're going to go ahead and remove the bottom 18 millimeter just to drop the shock out of the bottom. So that's under a little bit of pressure right there, so just be careful as you're bringing that down. Finish what we're doing at the top side here. So now that our shock is removed, we can go ahead and set that aside. Now that we have everything removed from the hub, we're going to go ahead and drop the axle. This will sort of swing down this way a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and pull this spring out here. Two 21 mil bolts back here. We're going to have to loosen these up as well. There's 121 here and then 121 up underneath here that this control arm runs to, and basically we're just trying to drop that axle to get that spring out. Again, we're not removing the whole thing, we're just getting them nice and loose so we can get that axle to drop. So now that these are all loose, we should be able to go ahead and drop the axle. So go ahead and press down on the axle, lift up on the spring, and bring the spring out. We're going to transfer this top cup to the new spring, and there's an isolator that sits on the spring perch here. That'll probably stay there, but if it comes with the spring, go ahead and transfer it to the new spring. So when we get this spring seated up in the top perch, this conical figure right here will actually sit flush in. It is easy to misalign this, so just make sure this is seated properly up into the top cup. So we'll go ahead and feed this spring up. And then once that's in place, we're going to go ahead and jack the axle back into place. Again, we just want to make sure that that spring is seated nice and flush with that top cup. Now that that spring is in place, we'll go ahead and reverse process. We're going to go ahead and put the shock in first to support the axle from dropping again. This in the shock perch, feed the 18 mil bolt straight through. And again, since this is self-threaded, we'll just go ahead and get it finger tight for now. After the top bolt is in, we're going to go ahead and jack up the bottom spring here, the bottom axle. Just get it so where the holes are lined up with the knuckle there. Bolt here, feed this straight through. In a reverse order, we'll go ahead and tighten this down. And now we can tighten the top 18mm bolt. So after we get the shock in, we're going to go ahead and tighten these back up. We're just going to get these snug for now. These are actually supposed to be tightened under load, which means the vehicle needs to be lowered back down on its own weight to tighten these, just because of the bushing compression there. So we'll go ahead and get these snug for now, and then when we get the vehicle back on the ground, you need to be sure to tighten them. They are pretty heavy, between 180 and 200 foot-pounds, so you need a big torque wrench for that. Mopar was nice enough to make this one a flag nut. Wish they made them all like that, but work with what we got. So just get these nice and snug here, like I said. So there's only 3 more things left to go back in here. We're gonna do our brake line brackets here. And this is the 10 mil that we took out earlier, and this one is the 13 mil here. Now we will put back our sway bar end link. Again, that's this bolt that we took off here. So right now we're just going to leave our sway bar end link loose. Since this side is now higher than the other, you won't be able to get these lined up properly. So we'll leave it loose for now, and we'll come back, tighten it all up once the other side is lifted as well. And then one other thing is just make sure you go ahead and put your splash guard on here with those 3 8mm bolts that we took out earlier. So now that everything is done on this side, we have our spring, we have our Rubicon shock, and we are going to move to the passenger side and repeat the whole process. There's a little bit of a difference over there. There's the driveline breather tube, as well as a couple of different bolts, but we'll show you how to do that next. So moving on to the passenger side, we're going to go ahead and remove the wheel. So again, it's a very similar process to the other side. We got our sway bar end link right here. We have our 13 mil and our 10 mil brake line bracket bolts. Shock absorber, that's what we're taking out, and the spring, that's what we're taking out. So we're going to go ahead and loosen up the sway bar end link. We'll take our brake line brackets off. We'll take our shock out, all while supporting the axle front with a floor jack. Go ahead and take our 3 8mm bolts out here. So now we'll go ahead and support the axle with the floor jack. We're going to go ahead and pull off the differential breather tube here. So you may need a pair of pliers. Just go ahead and set that aside. Basically, this comes off so we don't stretch this while we're dropping the axle. So this side, we actually didn't have to unbolt any of our control arms, which is nice, but keep in mind every car is different. You may have to do that on yours, and that's just these 2 21mm bolts here. One up top here and one down below here, but on our particular truck we didn't have to. That can be due to the weight of this side of the axle, but we're going to go ahead and pull our spring out. And again, we'll transfer this cone to our new spring. This has the little notch in it, so we want to make sure it lines up with this here. And our bottom spring isolator actually stayed with the axle like it did on the other side. This actually appears to be clipped in, so these probably won't come off with the spring, but if they do, transfer them over to the new spring. So just like our driver's side, this upper spring isolator has this cone in it, so we're going to make sure when that sits up, it goes inside the metal cone that's on the top. So now that the spring is in, I'm going to go ahead and start jacking up the axle again. Again, we want to make sure this sits nice and tight here against the cone at the top. Go. At this point, after the spring, the new Rubicon spring is in, we're going to go ahead and put our new shock in. Let's go straight up into the spring perch, or the shock perch right there. 18mm bolt through. Again, this is self-threaded. We can just go ahead and get this started here. Now we're going to jack the axle up to meet the shock here. Once the shock's in, we can go ahead and lower the axle back down slowly. And now, once the shock's in, we're going to go ahead, bolt everything back up. Again, we didn't have to loosen any of our control arm bolts on this particular side, so we don't need to retighten those back up like we do on the driver's side. We can go ahead and tighten up our stabilizer bar end link. Put our brake line brackets back on. So we're now done with our passenger side here. So you can see we got the new Rubicon spring. We got the Rubicon shock right here. We're going to go back over to the driver's side and just tighten up the stabilizer bar end link. And don't forget about your differential breather tube here. Last thing we just need to do here is tighten up the stabilizer bar end link. Not too tight there. And then we're going to go to the bottom here. So at this point, we can go ahead and put our wheels back on, drop the truck down to the ground, and we're going to go ahead and tighten these two 21 mil bolts up, as well as these here, 1 and 2, and we'll do that when the vehicle's on its own weight. So guys, we just wrapped up our suspension install for this 2020 Wrangler Sport. We actually installed the Rubicon suspension on it. Pretty easy for what it is. It gives you about a 1.5 inch lift. Part for part, it's an easy swap. You do need a good set of jack stands, a floor jack, and some time. But overall, I give it about a 5 out of 10 on the suspension scale. But it gives you an awesome look. It gives you a little bit of an elevated lift with that 1.5 inch. We're not selling these parts, but we wanted to show you guys just how easy it was to install this stuff. Check us out on Infotainment.com, where we have a whole range of products for not only this Jeep Wrangler, but a bunch of different vehicles. Thanks so much for watching.